So today and tomorrow, we're going to be talking about another situation that can happen when you are solving by square roots. And that's when, what happens if your c value ends up being less than 0 or negative? What do? It says if your equation does end up in the form that ax squared is equal to a negative c, this means our equation does not have what we call real roots. A great example is x squared plus 4 equals 0. Now, if we were solving this problem by square roots, and you can see the graph over here, notice that the parabola does not cross the x-axis. So really that means that there are not going to be any real solutions for x. And here's what happens, and this is why. Our first step, if we were going to solve by square roots, would be to subtract 4 from both sides, and that would get us to x squared equals negative 4. Our squared terms by itself, and so then we would square root both sides. The problem is that when you try to type in the square root of negative 4 on the calculator, you get an error. So we have to have some way that we can deal with this, because if we have an x in the equation, we should be able to solve for x. But you can see from the picture that it's not going to actually have a solution for x that's real because it doesn't cross the x-axis. And so what we use is we use what we call our imaginary unit, and it's I. And I is really just representing the fact that when we solved this problem, we did end up having to square root a negative, and the I value represents that. By definition, I has a value of the square root of negative 1. That also means that if we squared both sides, that I squared is equal to negative 1, and we'll use that in the next video. But the fact that the square root of negative 1 is defined as what I is equal to is going to allow us to write down some kind of answer, what we call it a complex solution for this type of problem. If you look at the properties, what it says is if r is a positive real number, then the square root of negative r can be represented by I times the square root of positive r. For example, if you look at the square root of negative 3, that can be represented as I times the square root of positive 3. The reason this works is if you think about if you have the square root of negative 3, we could break that into two pieces. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3. The square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 3 will not simplify. And so that's how we can use this property. So if you come down here where it says solve each quadratic equation, you're really just going to be doing this using the method of solving by square roots. So in this first problem, 2x squared plus 11 equals negative 37. I want to get the squared part by itself, so the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 11, and that will get me to 2x squared equals negative 48. I'm going to then divide by 2, and that will get me to x squared equals negative 24. And I am ready to now square root both sides. The square root of negative 24 is going to be the same as I times the square root of positive 24. And yes, you still need your plus or minus because we added the square root to the problem. And yes, you still need to check to see if 24 will simplify. And it will, because we can now break positive 24 into the square root of 4 and the square root of 6. Well, the square root of 4 becomes a 2, and so our final answer for this problem is x is equal to plus or minus 2I times the square root of 6. If you look at example 2, we have 3x squared minus 7 equals negative 31. Again, our goal is to get the squared part by itself so we can use square roots. I'm first going to add 7 to both sides. That will get me to 3x squared equals negative 24. I'm going to divide by 3. And that will get me to x squared equals negative 8. To get rid of the squared, I am going to square root both sides, and the square root of 8 can be represented by I times the square root of positive 8. And then again, when you check to simplify 8, which will break down into square root of 4 and square root of 2, this becomes a 2, and so your final answer is x equals plus or minus 2I times the square root of 2.